even today, the worldly powers and the hegemony is obviously is very known to everyone. So who really has the more powers? It is really important to really um, run the countries and how the economic runs and how the political the landscape start to kind of played out. So obviously in ancient times no different. So let's go back to the time of when Carthaginians and the Romans were kind of like trying to just fight back and forth and trying to just gain the control of the regions to where they're living in. So if we go back to the time of BC 247s and through the 183 in BC, of course, there is a what it's called the Punic War between Rome's. I don't know if you ever heard of general name of Hannibal. Hannibal is a very well known general in um, warfare history. He's one of the most famous um, the generals in history. So at that time, through the Roman era, the Hannibal was not a Roman general, and but rather than a Carthaginian general. I don't know if you know where Carthaginian is. So Carthaginian is located where northern part of Africa. Um, so let me see if I can actually just show you briefly where the uh, actually I should have actually prepared this images. Just 1 second. Not the best picture. Not the best picture. Let's use this image. Do you see my screen here?
Mm-hmm.
When you look at this image, this is Rome, obviously. This is Italy, as you know today, right? So this is the Rome's, and this part you see this a little bit greenish, the greenish color on this map on this side. So this the big part right here down below, as you can see here. This is Egypt right here, right? So this is Jerusalem right here. So this part is Israel, and this is Egypt. This is the northern part of the Africa. All right. So all this northern part of along the coast area, this is where the Carthaginians used to really just to control. So this is the big part, almost like all the areas along the coast guard is governed by the Carthaginians. So in ancient time, having a control of the sea is literally equates to the power of the country. So it is important to take control of those seas. So whoever controls that area will get more economical benefits, and then all these trades have a control of the trades. So obviously, it could bring a lot more power into the countries and the people who are living in the areas at the time. So if you look at some of the areas in the past times, so this is some of the um, remaining of the Carthaginians' historical remains. So you will see right here, they're looking down the seas, right? It's a beautiful cities, right? Unfortunately, everything has been ruined, so there's no really the historical fact that it's remaining in today, but only right here, right? Oops. Yeah, so like right here. So you will see how beautiful this city was in the time of Carthaginians was ruling these areas. So that's what the Carthage is about. But the Carthage was basically literally dominating the Mediterranean trade power in the North Africa. So obviously having the power of a navy, as I mentioned, they controlling the trade in the Western Mediterranean areas. Meanwhile, Romans are not as competitive and not as powerful as Carthage, but they're gaining the power and they're emerging powers and they're trying to get control of that particular regions. So they had a very strong armies, but they're literally had the powers on the land, not on the sea area. So Roman Empire was started to kind of gaining their power by expanding their territories, and they're started to kind of like looking out where the Carthaginian was having a control of. So they were trying to get a control of all the Mediterranean trades. So since there's a two power of countries are colliding, of course, that leads into a war, just like today's. So eventually, the Roman Carthage, went over the war in Sicily, and which is the strategic, the Mediterranean trading hub where it used to be. You know where the Sicilia is, right? Yeah, the Sicilia is like southern part of the Italy. So it's it's not really small, but it's a big island in Italy's. The Sicily is literally the closest part of northern Africa. So gaining the power in the area is important for the Romans. So the first Punic War between the Carthaginians and the Roman happened during the time of BC 264 to 241. So the first Punic War ran for almost like 23 years, very long time. And as I mentioned, Carthaginians dominate the seas while Romans dominate the land. So there is a power games. One side they're dominating the sea, the maritimes, and the other one is dominating their land. So, but obviously the armies are much stronger in the land versus the navies who are much more stronger in the sea. Obviously, the battle between the two doesn't really just mix up very well. So, towards the end of the Punic War, and Romans, for the first time, they introduced a new naval tactics and using a device called corvus. The corvus means it's a craw. What it does is it's create the mobile, the bridges to broad enemy ships and engage the close to combat in the seas. Because as I mentioned, Romans are much stronger on the land, right? So what they did was when they actually put the ships right next to their enemy's ship, what they do is they put a board over or the bridge over between the two ships. They just place the bridge between the ship and the Roman soldiers who go across that bridge to the ship and then kill them, which was a kind of new tactics and strategy they never seen before. But this is a kind of new strategy that Roman, came up with. So the corvus, strategy worked very effectively for the Romans, because soon after they actually get on ship, obviously the fighting with the Carthaginians was much easier. So the Roman was using the new tactic to really attack the Carthaginian, using this Corvus was very easy for to defeat the Carthaginians, the navy systems. So Carthaginian obviously losing the battles on the sea because of the new tactic the Romans brought up, and so they kind of learned the new strategy the Roman was using. They're trying to just to kind of cope with the new strategy they came up with. So they obviously used a different methodology to really attack the Romans during the Punic War. But obviously, it was getting very close to the first Punic War period. So Roman was strengthening their naval powers, and they believe that they only need to really protect the seas instead of the land, and because they already have gained the powers on the land as well. And so when they were having the war between the Carthaginians and the Romans, obviously most of the wars, especially the Punic War, happened during the time was on the sea, because there's no other way for them to fight, because there's no land in between those two, the part of the regions, because the Romans was on northern side of the land, whereas the Carthaginians living in the southern part of the regions, which is like separate by the sea. So war was happening always on the sea. But since Carthaginians was kind of thinking, which was actually run by the many generals and Carthaginians, they came up with, how can we defeat this Roman soldiers and armies? So there's where the Hannibal, the general, comes in. And Hannibal actually came with brilliant kind of ideas of how to attack the Romans. So obviously, Carthaginians are living in the northern part of the Africa, right? So they had a lot of elephants. But what can you use with the elephant on the sea? There's no use for the elephant, right? So they cannot really use that kind of powers. So what Hannibal decided to do is they decided to go across Alp. You know where the Alp mountain is, right? If you think about this, let me see if I can bring the map again. Let me see. All right, so let me just share this. Oh, what happened here? Let me share my screen again. All right, do you see my map again?
Mm-hmm.
So as I mentioned, this is a Sicily, right? I told you before, right? This is a Carthage. So they're usually fight right here in the Mediterranean Sea. But Hannibal came up with the ideas that no one ever thought. So you see this kind of purplish color right here, northern part of the Africa? This is all run by the Carthaginians, right? So as you can see, this area, as you know, was actually run by them. So what Hannibal did was he planned to go across right here on this land. You see this, the Alps right here on upper right here? He decided to go across on the land to come down from the top of the Rome, which Romans never ever thought of this as even possible, especially the armies going over the Alps, this is not something they ever thought of ever before, especially in the wintertime. I don't know if you ever been to Alps in the wintertime. It's pretty darn cold and there's lots of snows. So people don't even go across this Alps, the mountain, because it's impossible for any army to go across. And they never even heard of this kind of ideas ever before in their life or even in history. So that's the kind of idea that Hannibal had. They will never imagine that we will come across the Alps mountain to attack from the top. So what he decided to do is he started about, he brought elephants over the mountain with the armies of about 50,000 soldiers along with them. And literally, because they were going across the Alp mountain, you could imagine how cold it was. And for the people, which is the Carthaginians, right? They were living in the area where there was very hot and warm. And for those of the people going across the Alps mountain, you could imagine how they will be able to tolerate the coldness in that area. What happened was Hannibal brought 50,000 soldiers along with him, of course, with the elephants, and half of them died just going across the mountain because of the coldness. They could not tolerate, but it was too cold. So half of them died during the journey to the Romans, and Hannibal himself almost lost his vision during that trip because of the snows and the coldness. But Hannibal will successfully go across the Alps to get to Rome. Of course, Rome was not even prepared to fight with the Carthaginians. So they literally crumbled down. They literally struck by the Carthaginians' army, and they totally lost the battle. And they could not literally respond to the attack because it was unprepared from this kind of battle. So Hannibal's, with his Carthaginian army, literally won the victory over victories. And most famous the battle he had was the Battle of Cannae. This was the most severe battle between the Carthaginians, which ran by Hannibal's and Roman soldiers. And literally 50,000 Roman soldiers were killed, and over 10,000 the Roman soldiers were captured. So I told you how many people the Hannibal actually brought to this battle. 50,000 at the beginning, and I told you that half of them died during that trip, right? So he only had 25,000 soldiers along with them. Of course, he brought the elephant. I don't know who would actually imagine to bring the elephant to the Alps to go across that kind of, the coldness to get to the Romans. But he was able to do that. And Hannibal literally stationed in Rome for 17 years during the Second Punic War. Can you imagine that Carthaginians literally stations with his army in Rome for 17 years? How powerful and how great his directions and the power to fight against the Romans. So you could imagine. So since Hannibal was stationed in Rome for 17 years, of course the Romans still continued to fought against the armies for 17 years, but they could not win the battle against the Hannibals. So now you could imagine why Hannibal has been known as the most famous and also notorious generals in ancient time. Because if he wasn't him, the Carthaginian was probably, the lost their battles against the Roman Empire. So he dominated that area, and the Romans even respected him as a general, even though he was enemy. I mean, his powers and his strategies and his, the braveness, even Romans really respected his powers and his the way of fighting against the Roman Empire. So, since they were continued to lose the battle against the Carthaginians ran by the Hannibals, so they had to come up with some ideas. How can we defeat this Carthaginians or stations in Rome? So, because they were kind of limited the capacities and limited strategy against the Hannibals, the armies, so what they did was, let's come up with a new strategy. Rather than facing or the fighting against the Carthaginians, the armies that run by the Hannibal general, so instead, let's attack Carthage, the land of Carthage directly. Since he's away from his own country, we'll attack the Carthaginians where the absent of a Hannibal general. So they decide to attack the Carthage instead of fighting against the Carthaginians who stations in Rome. So what the Romans were thinking is that if we attack the Carthaginians in their own cities, Hannibal will have to pull back his armies to defeat or the fight against the Romans in Carthage. Which that strategy worked very well for the Romans. And because they attacked the Carthage directly on their cities, the government or the kings of Carthage was actually called the animal for help. So Hannibal had to really just leave the stations area in Rome to support the battles in the Carthage. So Hannibal had no choice to come back to Carthage to fight against these Romans. And he was actually fighting with the Roman general named Scipio. The war between the Scipio, which is the Roman general, against the Hannibal, was very, very well known in warfare history. And Hannibal's army, literally just exhausted from a very, very long campaign that he was running away from his own hometown, ultimately suffered, the loss. And the government and also the politicians in Carthage did not really support the Hannibal. And because of those complicated situations in Carthage and not trusting Hannibal's strategies and supporting him, obviously Carthage was actually lost the battle against the Romans. And when they had a third Punic War against the Romans, Carthaginian was lost the battle for all. So that's how that after the third Punic War, literally Carthage was disappear from our history. That's how we know as how the Carthaginians was actually disappear from our map. Because the war, the Punic War, first Punic War, the second Punic Wars, and the third Punic War just ran for many, many years. Obviously, both countries were lost so much money and so much the young peoples, and their economy started to kind of go downhill. But because the Roman actually just won the battle against the Carthaginians, and as I mentioned, the whole purpose of actually, having those war between the Carthage and the Rome was because to gaining the powers of the seas, so they can bring more trades into their areas. So after Roman Empire took down the Carthaginians and they took full control of that particular the sea area to bring all the trades, the sea trades, into their own land. After Hannibal lost the battles during that Third Punic War, he just had to flee because he didn't get support from his own Carthaginians. So he went to Seleucus Empire under Antiochus III. But literally, he was actually captured by Romans, and he ended his life with, taking the poisons. So that's how Hannibal General died at the end. That's how we know as a history today. And if Carthage's national power, and if their government and their king was a supported Hannibal, the history might have actually turned out to be completely different than how we know it today. But because the king and the government of Carthage did not really support the Hannibals, literally that's how tragedy came about. So then, why am I actually talking about the Punic Wars, and why am I start talking about the Hannibals all of a sudden into this picture? Because this kind of leads into a very, very important historical fact of how the Roman Empire started to really just the gaining the powers, and how the government was structures, and why certain people came up to the stage. So after the victory of the Punic Wars against the Carthaginians, obviously Romans' economy had gained more powers, and also economics flourishment literally just gained even more. So most of the noble peoples and people who were in the aristocrats, they were literally enjoying the Chinese silk cloth and China. Because when you think about back then in an ancient time, having the sea trade is the most powerful way to really gaining the economic powers as well as the political powers. So what they did was, if they show off the things that they never seen or own, which was a Chinese silk or or some sort of the China, the jewels, the Asian jewels, they were showing off their power. So they enjoyed that kind of things, and they were having parties every day, and they're trying to show off their wealth by having those Asian jewels and silks and so forth. So that's the only way to kind of like show their nobility, and as well as to show their wealth. Whereas the commoner, which is the most of the citizens, who really participated in the battles, like Carthaginians, or all the battles, who went on this kind of a journey to really just go on to the long journey to really fight against other countries and so forth, those armies and those soldiers, when they came back, they had nothing. They became more poor. Why? Because they had to even buy their own armors. They had to buy their the weapons. And these people are not really rich people, right? They were actually fighting for their own countries, but when they come back, they had nothing. The government did not really take care of these armies and soldiers who came from this battlefield. So guess what? How you think those soldiers who came back from this kind of battlefield felt about these nobles who didn't do things, but they're enjoying the richness and wealth and the power that they were actually having at the time? So the Roman soldiers who really went on the battlefield, they were like farmers, literally. And they just devote themselves and killed in the battlefield. They lost their sons and their husbands. And then, when they lost their sons and their husbands, what happens to the farmland? They could not keep up with their farmland. Then, since they could not keep up with their farmland, then what happened? Their land has been taken by the rich peoples and this wealthier, the people at the time. So they literally gained nothing. Even though they won the battles against the Carthaginians, when they returned, they had no place to live. They lost their farm. They had no money. They had no power. And this noble people divided up their own land and conquered their possessions. So they just literally, they continued to increase their, estate while all the soldiers and the farmers lost their estate. There's no farmland for them to really just to do anything with it. So the tension between this people who returned from the war against the noble people grew up. And literally just, since those noble people collected all the land from the farmers in a very, very cheap price, because literally they just took over their land without paying much money because they had to sell off their farm, right? So they continued to enlarge their estate, whereas all the soldier who came back really had no money, no food, no place to live. So from their perspective, when they returned, what they were facing was wasteland. And their level of quality of life had declined. So these soldiers who came back was just mad at this noble people. So since they lost the farmland, but they still have to continue to live. So what do? They became a slave because they're selling themselves. They're selling their family members because they need to live. They need to find the work. They need to eat. So after they came back from their battlefield, obviously they became slaves. So at the time, it's not like they're gaining any respect whatsoever, right? Of course, at the battlefield, they won, and they were very happy they won the battle. But what is in return? Nothing. They could not afford themselves. They had to just weaken their powers and living quality. So the noble peoples widening their wealth and also gaining more powers, and obviously those soldiers who came back and became slaves, they were looking for some freedoms, they were looking for some money, they were looking for some respect, that they were looking for a lot of stuff. And they started to have rebellions, of course, because of the situations they're in. And you could imagine why those kind of the situations grew up. Because the reason that I kind of gone over this Punic War period is because how, the Roman soldiers that gained, the won the battle, but at the same time when they returned, how the Roman society treated them. And you could imagine why there was so much of a trouble between those people who returned from the war against the people who just sit in the Rome, in the city halls and enjoying very expensive clothes and showing off their money and power and a land that they're possessing. So you could imagine the situations. So there was a very, very famous, called the Spartacus rebels during that time, and rapidly grow in strength because the people are gathering and supporting Spartacus rebels of the situations. So because of this rebel, one point the southern part of the Italy was literally controlled by the Spartacus. Spartacus was one of the gladiators. You probably heard the name gladiators, right? You probably saw the movies of the gladiators, right? And I heard there's another movie is coming up very soon. which is a sequel coming up. So now that's where the gladiators come from. Those people who used to fight in the battlefield, when they returned, they have nothing. So they became a Spartan. They're fighters. They became gladiators to earn money, right? Through their powers, tremendous, was gaining. And during 3 years of those, the time of the rebels, and they were eventually, gaining the more powers of the Roman armies of at the time, who's protecting the city of Rome. And the Romans' army demonstrated their cruelties by just literally crucifying those rebellions for 6,000 previous soldiers. And they literally just crucified them to show off how they will treat if they rebels. And Spartacus, who started the rebel, was killed. And people turned to his brothers, Gracchus. Gracchus was the brothers of Spartacus. And then everyone's looking up to him and said, we need to have more rebels to win over this nobles. And Gracchus literally spoke to the citizens who were trying to rebel against the Roman, Roman nobles, and he wanted to present all the farmers and all the previous armies, and literally says, all the citizens of Rome, the Romans nobles are monopolizing our land, and we need to protect ourselves. We need to protect our land so they cannot take our possessions. And whatever is remaining for us to really just live in, we need to distribute among ourselves and supporting ourselves. And that kind of a speech that he was, giving to all this, all farmers, they gaining more support. And under his enthusiasms and support of all the previous soldiers, it grew up. So Gracchus just restarted to form his own armies, and he was succeeding to fight against the Roman empires and their soldiers. And of course, the nobles in Roman empires was unsettled with this whole rebel. So they need to control this rebel so they don't come against them. So what they did was the Roman nobles hired the thugs to assassinate Gracchus. And he was assassinated by the thugs, which is commonly happened in today's world as well. And since that time, 10 years later, and another brother of Tiberius, which is Gracchus, started to reform this rebel again, to following his brother's the footsteps, literally. And of course, nobles did not want to have any more troubles, right? So what they actually did was they spread the rumors. They spread the rumors saying Gracchus is trying to become emperor and trying to gain the popularities of all the farmers so can control the Roman empires. And he's trying to just take over our land. So we have to fight against Tiberius, which was rumors spread by the nobles. And while he was trying to reform the rebels with all the farmers, because of the rumors, he was getting resistance from the farmers. And also, he was getting a lot of resistance from the nobles as well. And Roman nobles continue to really just to try to take down the Tiberius, and they marked all the people who followed the Tiberius and rebellious as the traitors of a Roman Empire. And they attacked the Tiberius. So Gaius Gracchus, which is his real name, and literally because he was up against his own supporters as well as the nobles, so what he decided to do was he actually chose to, kill himself. So he committed a suicide. And obviously, the Gaius Gracchus, since it was, killed himself, he lost the support from everyone else. And because of his death, the whole rebel failed, literally. But the sentiments of the farmers going up against the noble was stayed as well. So you probably heard of the terms republic, senate, assemblies, councils. And all these terms started from the Roman Empire. And this is the kind of Romans political, vocabularies and a term that they were using, which is still, even today's political system still adapts a lot of the systems from Greek as well as the Roman Empire. And when you think about the Romans, they started back in BC 753. That's when the Romans go back, how far they go back to start their own countries. At the same point, at early stage of the Roman Empire, they were ruled by different countries and different kings at the time. And when Romans drove out all the kings who was ruling in their regions, they actually formed as Senate to discuss how to proceed and what decisions they were going to make. So the Senates are the one who actually nobles assemblies to really just making a decisions and how they're going to rule their countries and how they're going to really making a decisions for all the national matters. It's very important. And they had about 300 Senate members, and each was elected to replace the kings. So there was no one person ruling everything, but they were ruling the government as the assembly of the senates. And they actually making a vote what they want to do and how they want to decide to making a decision for their national matters. And all these people who are elected people, they actually called what it's called consulates. And the power that they have to making a decision as a group was powerful, because their power of assembly is equivalent to the king for other countries. But what they don't want to see is the kings who's ruling everything. They want to be more of decisions of many people instead of one person making a decision. So this is where the system, the political system that they're building, which is the senates and council, they actually try to avoid any king's dictatorship or one person ruling out everything, like what the ancient countries used to do. So this is systems that they built is what they call as republic. So you hear the term republic, right? That term, the republic, still remains in our systems. And But the senates are all people as well, even though it is not a one person ruling the countries, but still group of people or group of nobles making a decisions. And while formally all this citizens or the commoners could participate as a senate's activities or become a consulate, but reality is there is a level difference. The people who came from the noble families and noble, characters and noble society versus a commoner who became a senate or the consulate. Of course, their title is the same, but there is a bias and there is a kind of a differentiating people who came from the wealthy families and wealthy, the society versus the people who became senates or a consul as a commoner. You could imagine even today's world, people who actually came from, certain families, or they just looked up and they said, wow, well, they came from this family. Whereas the people had no background on their families or wealth or name of their families, but the person who was very smart and became, someone who very famous, right? It's the same thing. So, what happened was there was a kind of what's called popular assemblies. And that's where the commoner who became a senate or a consulate was participating in gaining the powers. But obviously, even though they're trying to gain the powers, there was no popular vote from them because people who came from the wealthy families and better backgrounds, they were gaining more power than the people who became a consulate or the senate as a commoner. So that literally made it very dissatisfaction for the commoners. And they started to speaking up for their own protections for the people who became a senate or a consul. Even though they have that title, they do not have the real power like the others do. So they're saying, we as a commoners, we participate in the battlefield and we fight for our own countries. But all the nobles are taking control of and monopolizing the whole societies and taking all the possessions. And they're saying we need to protect ourselves. Remember, this is why the rebels started to begin with, because of this dissatisfactions. And even though they were keeping the positions, since they have no power, for those people who became a senate or a consul as a commoners, they started to really just thinking about what can they do to really protect their rights and protect their wealth and protect their lifestyles. So I'm going to talk about Julius Caesar and how Julius Caesar became Julius Caesar. So when Julius Caesar was young, literally, he escaped from Rome, and he was literally blacklisted person when he was young. So he's escaped from the Rome's. So Caesar decided just to look for some kind of refuge and where he can actually protect himself from, the Roman senates and consulates and those people who actually exercise those powers. So where he actually escaped from Rome was he went to Asia Minor. Asia Minor does not mean is Asia that we think of. Asia Minor, when we think of back then, is like Turkish. In today's modern days, a Turkey is what they consider as Asia. So this is why you hear, when you actually read Book of Acts, they were talking about going to Asia. that Asia is not Asia that we think of. The Asia that means is Turkey. Okay? So he became a soldier under the governors of that regions, Asia Minors. And he stayed there for a while. And when he was blacklisted by the leaders of Sulas, and after his death, Caesar returned to Rome when he became 22 years old. That was back in 78 BC. But obviously, Sulla's followers continued to make it very difficult for Caesar because he was blacklisted by him. And he ultimately decided to leave the Romes because he was getting so much of persecutions and troubles from all this Sulla's, the followers. So where he ran was he ran to the island of Rhodes, the small, very tiny islands. And while he was actually in a journey to go to the island of Rhodes, he was kidnapped by the pirates while he was trying to just flee to that place. So pirates, when people, when they kidnap, what did they do? They try to sell or put a price tag on the people who they actually kidnapped. So when they receive the payments, they release that, kidnapper, the people who they kidnapped. Otherwise, if they don't get any money or the payment, they kill them. So that's what the pirates used to do. So after they actually captured the Caesars, obviously they did not know who he was at the very beginning, but later the pirates leaders found out who Caesar was. So you're the noble from Rome. Aha! So we're going to put a big price tag on you. So they put a big price tag on Caesar. So 20 talents was put on his name tag. You could imagine how expensive 20 talents are. I went over the price of talents. We've gone over the denarius, right, versus talents, right? So 20 talents is very, very expensive price tag. So with the 20 talents, literally it's an amount that they can recruit enormous of thousands of soldiers with the money that they put on Caesar's. Caesar, on the other hand, he was actually very, very smart. He outsmarted the pirates. And he said, you know what? 20 talents for me? You're undermining my powers and my nobility. You know what? I need to be at least 50 talents. They put a 20 talents on his name tag, and Caesar was claiming, no. My nobility in Rome's 20 talents is too cheap for my name tag. If you want to just put a name tag on me, you need to put at least 50 talents on me. And there were eyes were like what? 50 talents? Wow. He must be really, really just high up in the ranks. So what happens? 50 talents. He's a very, very expensive proposition, isn't it? What they should do is make sure their very, very expensive propositions need to be kept very well, right? If this gets ruined, they don't get the amount of money that they're looking for. So what they did was taking very, very good care of Caesar. Because he's so expensive. He's so expensive. So you have to take care of him very, very well. Oh my God, we need to really care him very well. We need to feed him well. We need to take care of, protect him. So make sure that he doesn't get ruined, right? So Caesar was very, very well treated by them, the pirates. So this story was very, very well known about the Caesar and what he did. So he created a sort of like, illusions, on this the pirates, saying that he is a very, very, high in the ranks, um, uh, in the Roman empires. So Caesar's freely running around in the island of Rhodes. He learned the regions. He learned everything what he needs to know. And after he learned all this, the land, he escaped from the pirates. After he knowing the regions very well and utilized the chance that he was taken care by the pirates. So he escaped. And then after he escaped from the land, from the pirates' hands, and he literally wanted to just pay the revenge against the pirates. So he actually brought all this, the soldiers, to attack the pirates and kill them all. After he came back to the land of Rhodes. He was about 35 years old at the time. And he was gaining reputations because of that incident that occurred. And his name was known to the public. So people at least started to hear about who Caesar is. So where did he get this money from to really bring all the soldiers? He literally lended money or to borrow the money. He was not rich at all, but he was actually borrowing the money as if he was actually, but to show to people as if he was very rich, even though he didn't really have money. He was showing off. You probably hear of a lot of, people really don't have any money, but they're like wearing very expensive like jewels and driving in very expensive cars, but they have no money. But they want to show off as if he's like rich, right? That's what Caesar did. And he was gaining popularity in Roman societies because of what he did and how he actually destroyed the pirates. And then later on, he actually became a governor of Spain because of gaining that popularities. So he was about 39 at the time when he became a governor of Spain. And when he was leaving the governors, as I told you before, he borrowed a lot of money from people because he did not have money. So he had a lot of creditors, right? Chase after him for money. So since he had no money, so he could not pay. So what he did was he went to the most wealthiest man in Rome to get support, utilizing his own popularities. And then the wealthiest man in Rome to really pay off his debt for him, which was very smart. So, since he was continued to gain a lot of popularities in Roman the societies, he was aiming to go higher and higher in his ranks and a position in Rome. And after he finished his, successful term as a governor of his Spain province, he became consulate, which is the most highest ranks in the societies, which was impossible dream for him, but he became a consul. After he came back from Spain's and stayed in Rome, became a consulate. This consul roles only last for 1 year. It's not like forever you can stay. So there's a terms that you can serve as a consul. So he could only have 1 year term as a governor and as a consul in Rome. So the next terms he was looking for, but he needed some help. So he started to kind of like gaining a support from Pompey and Crassus. You probably heard of the name the Pompeius and as well as the Crassus. So he needed some help to really kind of like elevate his positions. So Pompey is one of the Roman general that you know, and he literally surpassed Spartacus, the rebellions, and eliminates the pirates altogether. That's how he was known as a famous generals in Rome. And he had a tremendous of the powers and also the territories that he was governing. And through long years of like the campaigns that he was running. So since Pompey was very strong, senates were very worried and concerned about his power, because they worried that Pompey one day he's gonna really just took over the senates and kill everyone, and then just becoming the control of the Romans. So everyone was afraid and concerned about his powers, even though Pompeius has done so much for the Roman Empire. They refused to acknowledge his achievement because the senates were afraid of a Pompey. So Caesar knew the situations with Pompey. So Caesar approached to Pompey and he proposed, "General, if you make me a governor next year in elections, and if I gain the power, I will help you. I will support you. So, help me." And Pompey had no reason not to accept that offer or proposal. So Pompey accepted Caesar's proposal. And Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. So Crassus, as I mentioned, he was the most wealthiest person in Rome. So what does a Caesar have now? Most powerful army generals in Rome, most wealthiest person in Rome. So what do you think he has? He's got everything what he needs, right? So they were making an alliance together to gaining the powers of the Romans, all three. So this is the very first triumvirate. Triumvirate in Rome, this is the first time Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus sharing the power together. It's called triumvirate. And this is the first time they were actually making an alliance to gaining the power of the Romans. And as promised, Pompey and Caesar took some land from nobles, distributed to all the soldiers, which is what he promised. And this is a kind of the ideas that Gracchus' brother had failed to do so, and their rebellion failed. But now Caesar is the one who's doing this for the soldiers. So imagine what kind of a popularity that Caesar was gaining at the moment. Because he is taking the land from the nobles and distribute among all the soldiers who came back from the battlefield. So you could imagine how much support and also popularity he was gaining from all the soldiers around the Roman empires. So obviously he became a new consul because of the popularity he gained and the support from Pompey as well as the Crassus. And when he got control, Caesar got control, they started to have cracks between Pompey and Crassus and Caesar's. So that triumvirate alliance has started to like break apart. And that's usually what happens. And Caesar had really no intentions to remaining in Rome to begin with. He wanted to just go into the battlefield to achieve more the military glories and surpass the Pompey's achievements. And he was very ambitious. So Caesar requests the Senate to approve to really just the conquered or the battle against the Gauls. And the Gaul, the area, the regions that he was trying to go into the battlefield is today's and modern day, is where the France and the Western Germany area. Those are the area where he was volunteering to go to the battlefield. So, of course, the Senate wanted to just Caesar away from Rome, so they just authorized him to really go into the battlefield. And he was approved to go into the battlefield and hoping that he will not succeed and get killed in the battlefield. That's what the Senate were really thinking of. So that's why they endorsed him to go into the battlefield. So Caesar and the Senate had, of course, a different things in their mind. And when Caesar was dispatched to the Gaul area, the regions, 7 years later, which is not what the consuls expected, he gained a lot of popularity and he also won the battle. And then he was literally gaining so much support from the soldiers and from the citizens of the Romans. So senates were very, very anxious of the return of Caesars. They're very concerned about it. And now Pompey now concerned about Caesar as well, because now he's outperforming his own achievement. So Pompey, in the past, he was alliance with Caesar's. Now he's going against the Caesar. Right? Today's a friends became an enemy tomorrow. So Pompey was going up against the Caesar's powers. But since Caesar was gaining so much support, even though he's just jealous about the Caesars and he wanted to just to remove the Caesars, he had to come up with some ideas. So at the time, Crassus, the third person who was supporting Caesars, he died. And Pompey, the general, betraying the Caesars, joining with the Senates, the triumvirate literally now it's cracked and no longer was holding any value at all. So Caesar, of course, knows that Pompey now working very closely with the Senate to drive out the Caesars. and trying to eliminate the Caesar altogether, Caesar requested extensions to stay in the region as a governors, and they actually disproved for him to stay as a governor and request him to return to Rome. But the rule is you cannot bring army to the Rome by rules. So come back to Rome's without your army. So obviously, the plan is very clear, exactly what they will do to Caesar. And of course, Caesar is not dumb, so he knows exactly what they're going to do. So what Caesar did was, instead of coming solo, he brought the armies, which he shouldn't be doing it, but he did. So he brought the soldiers. So what he did was he brought the soldiers, but instead of bring all the armies with him all together, he told his armies, stay outside the Rubicon rivers. Stay. Stations there for. Don't come. So he just come in and told you as army, come after me after I enter into the Roman cities. So he actually planned out as if senates and the councils believed that he was coming as a solo, not knowing the soldiers was actually stationed right across the rivers. So they were relieved that he was coming as a solo. While they're all relieved and not preparing anything, literally Caesar called his armies to follow him. So the army ran into the city, that literally captures and dominated the city of Rome. Of course, now who gains the power? Caesar did. And he literally controlling all the cities and capture all the senates and nobles. And since there was no army in the cities, as expected, right? So the senates and the Pompey literally said, let's get out of the Rome, and let's just gather all the armies and counteract against the Caesars. But of course, the Caesar would not let him. And he captured Pompey and all the senates so they don't run away from the cities, because he needs to have a full control of the city of Rome, right? So since he took control of all this noble senates and Pompey, no one could go up against the Caesars. So all of a sudden, he gained the power of the Romans. Of course, there still is a systems of republics, but he was gaining as almost like emperor. But he was not an emperor, but he was almost gaining this kind of powers. And because he gained the power, he what is the word that I'm looking for? He was taking a control as a person who can rule the Roman Empire or the Roman cities. So they saw Caesar as a dictator. Because remember, their political system is republics and senates controlling all the decisions. But now, since the Caesar is the one who is actually gaining the powers and diminishing the power of the senates and the generals, so people see it as Romans, not Romans, a Caesar as a sort of a dictator. But this is the view of the senates and the generals, not the view of the republics or the citizens. Remember, how did Caesar gain the popularity and the support from the citizens, because he took the possessions and the land from all these nobles, peoples, and distributed the land, right? So he was gaining lots of support from the publics and citizens of the Romans. But Caesars, acting as sort of a dictators for those senates and the generals of the cities. And since they were actually seeing those noble characters, or the noble senates and the governors, they're seeing Caesar as the dictators. So what they should do is they're trying to kill him. So Caesar was literally ignoring the senates, and he did many things for all the publics and citizens. So you could imagine how much hatred he was getting from senates and nobles versus how all the citizens of Rome was supporting him and gaining the popularities. Everyone loved him except those noble, people and the generals of the Romes. And since the senates were hated in him, they decide to assassinate the Caesar. And as you know, Caesar was assassinated, right? In BC 44. Well, you know who killed the Caesars, right? Brutus, which he was loyal followers of Caesar's, who Caesar really took care of him very, very well. And he was really betrayed by the trusted subordinate Brutus. And you know what he said when Brutus assassinated the Caesars. You too, Brutus? Right? You know that well-known word out of the Caesar's mouth. So this is actually how the Caesar ended his life, and how Senate try to take the control back from the Caesars. So then we need to talk about Octavian's Augustus. Who is Octavian's Augustus? I just realized that it's almost 11:51. I really need to go much more stories of I haven't even gone to where I need to be. It's almost 11:51.
It's a historical lesson. There's so much history to cover.
Yeah. So Octavian's Augustus is a very important person to really understand, because we're getting closer and closer to the story that I want to get to, because Caesar's and Octavian Augustus plays a very important roles of how Herod is actually played his political games with them. So let's talk about the Octavian Augustus. So after Caesar was assassinated, the whole citizens of Rome was, paying attention. Who will be the Caesar's successor is what they're paying attention to. Who will be actually ruling the Rome's, since Caesar was assassinated, right? So potential successor there are a few, which was Mark Antony, which was a Caesar's right-hand man, and Caesarions, which is a Caesar's sons, from Cleopatra the Seven. The Cleopatra the Seven is the one that you know as a Cleopatra, right? She was literally the rulers of Egypt, which was the last, the queen of Ptolemaic Empire. So we can talk about how actually Caesar's and Cleopatra got together and have a sons, which is Caesarians, which is very important to understand this story. So I'm going to have to get to that. So Caesar left no will. Who will be his successor? Who will be his chosen successor? No, I'm sorry. He left the wills. Who will be his successors? So, the person Caesar who named as a successor is Octavians. So, who is Octavians? Octavians is only 18 years old, and people did not know who Octavia was at the time. So I just talked about Octavian Augustus. Augustus is what we see in the Bible. So when you actually take a look at the go to I think it's Book of Luke. When you go to Book of Luke, chapter 2, when you turn to a Book of Luke, chapter 2, this is what it says. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This Augustus is the one that I'm just talking about, Octavian Augustus. So this is the person that I'm actually talking about right now. So who is Octavian's that Caesar would name as a successor? Octavian's mother was Caesar's niece. Octavian's mother was a Caesar's niece. After no, I'm sorry, it's not a niece. Octavian's mother is the I'm trying to just think about this for a moment. Yeah. When Octavian's father died early, when he was very young, and his mother married again, and Octavian was raised by his grandmother, which is grandmother was Caesar's sister. So Octavian was raised by the Caesar's sisters, Julia Caesarus. So since Octavian was raised by the Caesar's sister, of course Caesar took care of him. And the when you think about it from the public's perspective, who's Octavian? Octavian's is Caesar's sister's grandson. So it's sort of a line of a Caesar. Because Caesar was so much of a, gaining the respect and popularity from the public. The public wanted to really just have a successor as someone who's actually in the line of a Caesar. So they wanted to prefer Octavians to become a successor. But once again, he was very young, only 18 years old when Caesar was assassinated, right? So Caesar was really watching over Octavians and point them as his successors, while nobody really knew about Octavians. But even though he became an official successor by the Caesar's will, he was young, he had no power, he had no money, right? So Caesar had his right-hand man Antony. Antony was one of the generals under Caesar's, which he was. Antony was a right man of Caesar. So Caesar told Antony to execute his will, to have Octavianus to become his successor. Of course, Antony, who has the most powers in army, right? Even though he was a right-hand man of Caesar's, of course, he has his own ambition as well. While Caesar was making Octavian as his successor, we have to say that the Cleopatra from Egypt was thinking that she hoped that her son to become a successor of a Caesar, because his son is between Cleopatra and Caesar. So she was hoping that her son will become a successor, but obviously Caesar did not appoint his son Caesarion as a successor. So you could imagine how much Cleopatra was disappointed and also felt that she was betrayed. Right? When Caesar was assassinated, Octavian was in the military trainings outside the Rome. And when Caesar's death was announced, all the officers who were supporting the Octavians really worried about the Octavians, because they were worried that Octavian might be killed. They were worried that Antony might actually destroy the Octavians, which was the successors named by the Caesars. So Octavian says, I'm a Caesar's son. Of course, he was adopted, and Caesar's heir. If I actually just flee from Antony, people will laugh at me, and people will not consider me as a successor of the Caesars. So, risking his own life, and he went to Rome and claiming that he's the heir and he's the successor of a Caesar, while Antony already took control of the Romans because of his own ambition. And it's already 12. And unfortunately, I can't continue anymore. So we'll just wrap up our historical fact here.